Hello, welcome to Dale Street Online. It's Sunday the 26th of July and we're starting a new series of devotionals online each week. And the new series is entitled We Were Made for This, the 5G Christian. So we have 5 weeks of subjects and all beginning with the letter G. And today we're thinking about we were made for glorifying. One of my lasting memories was of the report of Tom in the car with Joe one Sunday morning travelling to church. He was very young at that time. And looking out of the window in front of the car, the clouds opened and some strong rays of sunshine broke through the clouds and were shining through. And Tom turned to Joe in a simplistic way and said, "Is that God's glory?" I guess actually it's a good question. What does God's glory look like? How do we recognise it? Actually, what does it look like in our lives? And I think it's quite difficult to talk about that and about shining when we think about the backdrop of the darkness of this world in which we live. I was listening just recently to the testimony of a Christian lady, probably in her mid-40s, but she had been blind since being very young in her early years. And she began her testimony by saying that every day she opened her eyes, it was dark. And just at that point, that really made me think. It really challenged me. It really put into perspective what it must be like not to be able to see, that every day she opened her eyes, it was dark. Not only was she unable to see, but her whole perspective was full of darkness. But she did say that this journey here is only a temporary journey, and she was looking forward to the day when she would be in heaven and the full light and the radiance of God's glory would be revealed to her. This was only temporary, but the vision was of the light to come. Well, I can tell you that I'm a true Yorkshireman through and through, and my character does not allow me to spend a lot of money on expensive jewellery. If you speak to Jo, she would reinforce that view and tell you that it's true. But this I do know, that if you visit a jeweller who has some expensive diamonds, if there was a potential purchaser, he wouldn't get the diamond out and just put it on the counter and ask the purchaser to have a look. What he would do is to get a box that's either backed with some black velvet or some dark navy blue velvet, or maybe even open up a scroll of material. He would place the diamond on the dark background, and then what he would do is he would add the additional light. And by the adding of the light opposed to the dark background, the diamond would shine in every facet. It would just reflect the light in all the facets of the diamond. And I guess we were made for this. Against the backdrop, against the background of the darkness of this world, when the glory of the light of God shines in our lives, that we might reflect every facet of our life in His glory. And so we're looking in these new subjects, this series of 5 devotionals. We're looking at the second letter to the Corinthians. And I just want to read 2 verses from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 16 to 18. And it says this: "But whenever someone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. For the Lord is the Spirit, and wherever the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So all of us who have had the veil removed can see and reflect the glory of the Lord. And the Lord, who is the Spirit, makes us more and more like him as we are changed into his glorious image. Paul also speaks in the first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 10 verse 31, and he says this: "Whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God." So when we're talking about the glory of God, we're not talking about something that's hollow and distant and something that's unachievable or futuristic. We're actually talking about the presence of God and the substance of God and the light of God and the voice of God in our lives. And that's where we get the word in Hebrew, kabod, C-H-A-B-O-D. That just means the fullness of glory, or the dimension of glory. Just before Christmas, I bought a friend a daily reading devotional book, and there's a passage each day to read, and it's actually based on the writings of C.S. Lewis. Obviously, he's now just over halfway through it, and said actually it's quite tough going sometimes. But some of the references are to the writings of Lewis in a book called The Weight of Glory. And that is what the word kabod means. It's the substance of glory, his presence, his voice shining through us. As you know, normally at this time we would be at Yorkshire Christian Camp. In fact, today we would be on the field, maybe having a meeting, maybe having lunch. Depends on what time you're listening to this, but maybe even having some activities in the afternoon. I've been going to camp for 55 years. And over those 55 years, I've witnessed and listened to over 300 different speakers or sermons. There are some that have really stood out to me. I think back to the 70s where George Tryon was the resident evangelist with his holy medals. I also think to the time when John Butterfield, bless him, got a 8x4 sheet of plywood on the stage and with paint rollers and paint brushes tried to depict a Bible story. And I guess the way that it went, we could have probably still been there now trying to recognise the feeding of the 5,000. I also remember some years ago Nigel McQuaid speaking to us and the acting of swimming in my swimming pool. More recently, I think of Kenny, who's been and shared with us, and also the guest appearance of Jeff Lucas. But actually the most memorable occasion for me was when Dennis Noon took the platform at camp. And I believe it was probably the only time Dennis has spoken at camp. He would probably be able to confirm or otherwise. But I do remember Dennis bringing to us a message. And he told of a home where he used to live and revisiting that home some years after. And when he came to that home, indeed the home was now abandoned. It was discarded. The front door was hanging off. The windows were broken. The curtains were blowing in the wind. And what used to be the substance of a family home, with all the memories and all the noise that went with it, was now empty. And what I remember Dennis doing was clearly stating, Ichabod, which means the glory is gone. The glory has departed. We've been just thinking about the word kabod, which is full of glory, the weight of glory. And the word that we've just thought about, Ichabod, which we in our English version have transferred to Ichabod, means exactly opposite, that the glory has departed. We find that word only once in the scriptures. We find it in 1 Samuel chapter 4. That's the only place that it's found. And that tells us of the record of Eli and his family and their demise. Eli had not done a particularly good job with his sons, and we know as we read the scriptures that his sons had abandoned God. And then there was a great battle between the Philistines and the Israelites, and his two sons were drawn into the battle. And there was a messenger that came back from the battlefield to Eli. Eli was now old at this time. And the messenger came to Eli as he sat there, and the messenger says, "Your two sons have been killed in battle." But he says more than that. The Ark of the Covenant has been taken by the Philistines. This was the very symbolism, the very essence of the presence of God with his people. We know that as they walked through the wilderness experience, the Ark of the Covenant went with them. It was the presence of God within the camp. And the presence of God had been removed. And the daughter-in-law of Eli, who was about to give birth, said that she would call her son Ichabod, because the glory had departed. The family of Eli and his sons had just stopped reflecting God's glory. And the question for us today is, how do we avoid that? How do we ensure that we reflect the glory of God? For this we were made. There's one verse that tells us exactly what happened with Eli and his family in 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 29. And three things took place that caused God's glory to be removed from Eli and his family. The first one was this, that they had abandoned the truth. The truth was not in them. The verse says, "So why do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings?" They'd actually forgotten who God is. They were more interested in their own desires. Their personal interests came before being obedient to God. They were ignoring the requirements of the offerings and the worship and bringing those to God. They'd omitted to bring him their offerings, and their selves had become more important than God himself. The scriptures remind us in the first epistle of John, if someone claims I know God but doesn't obey God's commandments, that person is a liar and is not living in the truth. It's interesting when I wrote down the two words kabod and Ichabod. Kabod meaning the fullness, the weight of glory, and Ichabod meaning the glory has been removed. There is no glory there. The glory has departed. Between the two words, the only difference is the introduction of the letter I. And that's what had happened in this family's experience. I had become more important than God. And that's why Paul writes in the first letter of Corinthians that we've already read together, whatever you do, do it for the glory of God. Because the world's view is to do everything for ourselves. We are more important than anybody else. That's what the world would declare. Football this week has been important in our household. If you were unaware, the football championship closed this week, and the football team that I followed from being a very young boy, since my first interest in football, Leeds United. And as a child, as a teenager, I visited the ground and watched them home and away many times. And after 16 years of being in the wilderness of the Championship and lower, Leeds United have now been promoted back to the Premiership. And there were great celebrations this week. On another scale, Barnsley FC, the town in which I was born, I've been brought up, and my family, and Tom, our son, that's his pride and joy, Barnsley Football Club, the Tykes. And through some amazing feat, Barnsley have achieved survival in the Championship. There was absolutely no possibility 3 games ago, but amazingly, this week, they managed to stay up. And in our modern day game, there are 2 players who I guess the discussions have been for years now. Who is the greatest? We've got Lionel Messi from Argentina, and we've got Cristiano Ronaldo from Portugal. And the discussions rage on about who is the greatest. Indeed, both of them themselves would claim to be the greatest, and there's disagreement between them. A reporter was said to have been and interviewed Cristiano Ronaldo about the effects that he's had on the game of football. And he said this statement, and I read it to you. "I believe God has sent me into the world to teach people how to play football. God has sent me to show you how to do it." At a later occasion, the same reporter was interviewing Lionel Messi, and he said to him about the statement that Ronaldo had made. And Messi replied these words, "I can tell you honestly, I don't remember sending him." It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking it's all about us, that we are the most important thing. But if we're going to glorify God in our lives, He needs to be central in our thoughts, in our decisions, in our actions, and in our very existence. They'd abandoned the truth. Not only that, the Bible goes on to say that they'd forgotten the poor and the needy. It says in the same verse, "For you have become fat from the best offerings of my people Israel." They'd abused their position of being within the priesthood as the people brought their offerings of animals, of grain, of even their finance. That these guys had enjoyed the benefits of that. They'd got fat, whether that was physically through the eating of the animals and the grain, or whether that was fat richly through the money and the offerings that were brought. But they'd gained more from those who had nothing but were bringing what they had. These guys had gained. They'd lost the art of serving. They'd forgotten, they'd abandoned the poor and the needy. The New Testament is filled with verses about instructing us to share with each other, to give to each other, to love one another, to carry each other's burdens, and to serve others. And the Lord Jesus specifically referred to this in the Sermon on the Mount, when he says these words about being a light that shines. He said, "So let your light so shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." The Lord Jesus was specifically saying that what brings glory to the Father is the way that we serve others, the way that we love others, show compassion, the way that we give to others, and the way that we serve. Ravi Zacharias, who's a well-known Bible teacher of our day, tells in his testimony of the greatest blessing that he's ever received. He's spoken all over the world in all sorts of gatherings, and people have said some very positive things about his ministry. But he says the greatest blessing, the greatest commendation that he ever received was on a visit back to his homeland, India, and to the city of Delhi. Whilst walking in the city, he walked behind a lame man. He'd lost one of his legs. He was in a wheelchair, pushing himself. The other leg was badly scarred. And he just felt he had to give this beggar some money. But in the area in which he was, he would have been completely enveloped by people begging. So he followed the guy, and as he crossed the road and pushed himself to the other side, to an area where there were less people, Ravi stopped this man and knelt at the side of his chair and gave him the gift of a 100 rupee note and asked that God would bless him. The man looked down and opened his hand carefully and looked at the 100 rupee note. Probably never received anything of that volume ever before. It was great to this man. It was hardly anything to Ravi, probably £1.50. And the man looked at the note and he said to Ravi, "Respectful sir, may God richly bless you." You see, the man couldn't give him anything at all, but he gave him his blessing and he gave him his prayer. And so the Lord said, "Let your light so shine that the people around might see your good works, and the result that they will glorify your Father in heaven." They'd abandoned the truth. They'd abandoned their service to the poor and needy. And finally, they'd abandoned God. In that same verse, God says to them, to Eli, "You have given your sons more honour than to me." A couple of weeks ago, Bryony shared on Meet the Church, which is a lovely part of our online offering. Each week we see somebody else just sharing with us. And Bryony shared her go-to verse, her favourite verse. It's Proverbs chapter 3. And the first part of what she quoted to us was in verse 5, and it says this: "Trust in the Lord with all of your heart, and lean not on your own understanding." As Solomon writes these words, he reminds us of the importance of not trying to lean on what we believe is right, or even not trying to lean on someone else's opinion, but the importance of relying on God and not to abandon God in our lives. For if his glory is going to shine in us and through us, if we're going to experience the glory of God and his presence and his substance and his light and his voice, then we need to depend on him and not depend on ourselves. It is to lean on him, to trust in him, and to walk with him. I was recently just looking on YouTube at some of the greatest moments of the Olympics, and possibly not the victories, but those significant moments of people who suffered hardship and overcame. In 1992, in the Barcelona Olympics, there was a runner for the Great Britain team, a guy called Derek Anthony Raymond. He was the 400 metres representative. In fact, as he went into the final in Barcelona, the team were confident that Derek would win the 400 metre final. The gun goes off and the race starts. He makes a good start and he's well positioned as he gets to about the 125 metre mark. And at that point, suddenly Derek pulls up. He pulled a hamstring. He was unable to run. He falls to the floor. And some of the attendees bring assistance to him, and they want to lift him and take him off the track. But Derek gets back to his feet and he says, "No, I'm going to finish the race." And he hobbles for a few metres. You can see the pain on his face. And then in the background you see a guy who jumps the barrier and starts to run onto the track. The security staff and the people there try and stop him, and he pushes them aside. And as he gets nearer to Derek, somebody else tries to stop him. He pushes them aside, and you can see in the words in his mouth, he simply says, "That's my son." He runs to the side of Derek And he takes hold of him, and Derek says to his dad, "Dad, I want to do this myself." And he says, "Absolutely, but I want to help you." It's on YouTube, have a look at it. And there's music that accompanies it. He lifts me up. It's quite touching. The story goes on, and you can see on the YouTube clip, as the singer sings, "He lifts me up," and my head is on his shoulder. You can see Derek physically leaning on his father, and his father takes him all the way around the track to within 5 metres of the finish line. And at that point, he allows him to go, and he finishes the race. He lifts me up. The glory of God is greatest when we are at our weakest and we rest on him. So if we want to see the weight of glory in our lives, if we want to reflect the glory of God to others, we need to hold to the truth. We need to serve those around us, and we need to lean on the Lord. Because for this we were made. We were made for glorifying. God bless.